Let's bring in right now NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki. He's at the big board. You know, Steve, in 2020, we saw the rural vote way down in the special election, the Senate special elections that have ended up putting Democrats in charge because a lot of Trump voters were not interested in voting in an election that Trump said was rigged. 2022. After us hearing about these new laws being Jim Crow 2.0 and how it was going to keep people from the polls, the early voting, the turnout in Georgia, record-breaking, massive. What does that mean for today's races, do you think?
Yeah, well, it speaks to the incredible high interest, like you're saying. Yeah, the stats here on the early voting in Georgia are just absolutely through the roof. So there's a ton of interest in these races in terms of what it'll say about the outcome. It would be a shock at this point if David Perdue, Donald Trump's candidate here in the gubernatorial race, ends up winning this or even forcing Kemp into a runoff. Remember, Georgia, a runoff state, you got to get more than 50% to avoid that. But here's the average of the polling. Kemp's been leading by more than 20 and has been comfortably over 50 in the polling that we've been seeing. So that's what Kemp takes into today. We'll see what happens tonight. You also have Herschel Walker in that Senate race. He does have some opposition in the Republican primary, but again, fully expecting Herschel Walker to carry the primary tonight easily. As you've been talking about, this is the mystery. This is the wild card. This is the one I suspect tonight in Georgia we're going to spend the most time watching. We don't have a ton of polling. As Caddy mentioned, you've got, despite the drama around the count in Georgia in 2020, these candidates don't have the kind of name recognition and the kind of profile you have in like a gubernatorial race. So there's a lot of suspense here. But Raffensperger, the incumbent, Congressman Jody Hice, the congressman who Donald Trump recruited to challenge Raffensperger, and then two other candidates, David Belle Isle, who ran for Secretary of State in 2018. So there's a couple of questions here. One is, does this end up in a runoff? Do we end up in a situation where nobody gets 50% and Hice and Raffensperger becomes kind of a marquee race that then plays out over the next several weeks as the lone sort of statewide runoff in Georgia? That's one possibility. Again, we're kind of going into this with some mystery here because we don't really know what the polling looks like in this race. But this is the one I suspect tonight in Georgia we're going to spend the most time talking about. And if you look at some of the other races tonight, as you mentioned, other states voting, some key races we'll be keeping an eye on. This one here in South Texas, on the border, the region of the country that swung very, very sharply between 16 and 20 from the Democrats toward Donald Trump. Heavily Hispanic counties on the border. Here's a Democratic primary. A moderate Democrat, Henry Cuellar, in the preliminary, fell short of 50%, barely held off his progressive challenger, Jessica Cisneros. Can Cisneros knock off Cuellar in the runoff tonight? There are a lot of Republicans who hope she does because they believe this district in South Texas, this would have been unthinkable a few years ago. They believe this district is winnable for Republicans, especially if Democrats nominate Cisneros. And then the other big race here in Texas, is this it for the Bush dynasty? In Texas here, you've got George P. Bush in the runoff against Ken Paxton for Attorney General. You see the ground that Bush has to make up there. Some other races, too, as well. Arkansas, Alabama. Very interesting dynamic. If I can get the Alabama one up here, just a very interesting dynamic here because this is the Senate race where Donald Trump endorsed Mo Brooks, then pulled his endorsement from Brooks. And the latest polling we've seen in this race has shown Brooks surging. And last night, Mike Durant said that if Brooks makes the runoff with Britt, Durant said he will endorse Brooks. So despite losing Donald Trump's endorsement, we are now looking at a possibility. This is going to be fascinating tonight. Does Brooks indeed make that runoff? And does he go to that runoff with momentum?
Yeah, Steve, that is such a fascinating race. It's to fill the Senate seat by the retiring Richard Shelby in the state of Alabama. You have Shelby's chief of staff, Katie Britt, there that you just pointed out. But talk a little bit about, if you can, about this move from Mo Brooks. He was trailing in the polls when Donald Trump pulled back his endorsement. Brooks's sin was saying perhaps we should turn the page and look ahead rather than looking back at 2020. He lost Donald Trump and lost that support. But now, over the last couple of months, has picked up double digits and is right there within the margin of error again.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at the polling average on this, you've got Britt in the mid-30s, and then you've got Brooks and Durant about 5 to 7 points behind her. The polling initially was very favorable to Mike Durant in this race. He's fallen off over the last few months. As I said, I think it was very significant, I thought, that last night he indicated he would endorse Brooks. If Brooks edges him out here and gets into the runoff against Britt, Durant indicating he would endorse Brooks. You know, Britt's resume here, as you say, the chief of staff to Richard Shelby. She was the head of the Alabama Business Council. Both Brooks and Durant trying to run. I know Brooks is an incumbent member of Congress, but both trying to capture that kind of outsider, anti-establishment energy to paint Katie Britt as more of sort of a candidate of the insiders, a candidate of the establishment. And it's a real fascinating dynamic that Brooks has that endorsement from Trump withdrawn and has suddenly got momentum in this race. And again, if he could get through to a runoff with Britt, it is not at all out of the question he could win.
So, Steve, we're going to want to hear from you about this next race. So stand by. Pennsylvania's razor-thin Republican Senate primary, which still does not have a winner. A week after Election Day is now headed to court. Candidate Dave McCormick has filed a lawsuit in an effort to make sure any mail-in ballots that don't have a written date on the exterior envelope but were still received on time are counted. NBC News reports the suit notes that the state Supreme Court has previously ruled in favor of counting such ballots, and that a federal appeals court ruled Friday in a different state a race that rejecting ballots on slight technicality is against federal law. The campaign for McCormick's competition, Trump-endorsed Dr. Mehmet Oz, sent a letter over the weekend telling counties they should not accept those votes. So, Steve, what is the latest in the vote count? And then I don't know if you can prognosticate given this court battle.
Yeah, we could just show you kind of what the universe of remaining ballots is and how the court fight fits into that. So right now you've got Oz with a lead here, you see statewide, of 987 votes over McCormick. So what is left? There are approximately 200 overseas or... Sorry, again, I every time I write, this seems to happen these days. I'm trying to write the number 200. There's about 200 overseas military ballots yet to be counted. They're going to be counted tomorrow. There are about 800 remaining provisional ballots. They have broken exactly evenly so far between Oz and McCormick. So those 800 votes, you wouldn't expect it to swing this much either way. So what this really comes down to, I'll see if the number works here, about 5,400 max.
You got it. Mail-in
votes. Okay, that's the key number here. And that litigation you're talking about, I think, is going to decide how close to 5,400 we get in terms of mail-in votes that get counted here. The expansive reading, everything you're talking about there, if you end up counting all of those ballots that didn't have the date but did have the signature, I think you could get close to 5,400 mail-in ballots. If those don't get counted, that number could come down some. Basically, McCormick, you see why he's filing this suit. He needs he's been doing better than Oz when it comes to the mail-in ballots, so he needs as many mail-in ballots as possible counted. And then if he can get them counted, he needs to win them by an even bigger clip than he's been winning them by if he wants to erase that 987. But no matter where this lands, we are going to be in that automatic recount zone. As long as you're within a half a point, there's an automatic recount that gets triggered. So more realistically for McCormick, it may be here. Catching Oz in the initial count may be too much to do.
Right.
Could he cut it down to 300, 400? Could he cut it down close enough where it's plausible in a recount he actually pulls ahead? Because if it's a couple hundred votes in a recount, that wouldn't be unheard of. When it's closer to 1,000, that's a lot tougher to overcome in a recount.
But historically, from what we've seen so far, McCormick does better with the mail-in ballots. So he's fighting for survival here.
That's it. I mean, again, I think the expectation here is that whatever gets counted from the mail-in ballots will tighten this somewhat. McCormick has not been winning them at such a rate that even if all of these were counted, you would expect him to overtake Oz. So he would need to do even better with these remaining mail ballots than he's been doing to actually overtake Oz. But again, if you're McCormick, knowing there's a recount coming, a mandatory statewide recount coming, if you could just cut the gap, to with a couple hundred votes behind Oz, then your odds in that recount are who knows? That could be close enough. When it's more like 1,000 votes, though, and you have a recount, it's much less likely, much more rare that you see the outcome actually change.
All right, Steve Kornacki, thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow morning with results from today's races. Look forward to that. And for